With the official unemployment rate in Canada unusually low at the moment, it is particularly difficult for employers to find just the right employee. And it doesn't help that the way we typically go about that, resumes, interviews, testing, etc., might not really be the best way to proceed. Joining us now for a rethink on the best hiring practices, David Zweig. He is chair of the Department of Management and associate professor of organizational behavior and HR at University of Toronto Scarborough, and we are delighted to welcome you here to TVO tonight.
Thank you very much.
Can I say it's accurate that the way we've gone about hiring people for the last several decades really hasn't changed very much over the last several decades?
No, it actually hasn't changed for many, many decades. We rely very heavily on the interview to make selection decisions, and we can do it better.
Why do we do it the way we do it now?
Well, you know, the interview gives people a lot of comfort. It's comforting for people to be able to sit across the table from someone they want to hire, potentially hire, and to get to know them and get a sense of who they are and determine whether they're going to be a good fit for the job that they're hiring for.
Doesn't common sense tell you that if I sit down with you and I talk to you for 20 minutes, I'm going to have a decent sense about who you are and whether or not I want to be seeing your face every day for the next X number of years?
Common sense would tell you that. However, we also know from decades of research that the interview is full of bias.
Full of bias in what respect?
In a number of different ways. So we often get swayed by my initial impression of the candidate sitting across from me. So if I meet you and I like you, I'm going to look for evidence in that interview that supports my initial impression, and I'm going to overlook any possible negative things.
So what tends to be the stuff that people overlook because somebody's made a good first impression?
Well, you know, if someone makes a good impression with a nice handshake or a smile, or they're nodding a lot when the interviewer is speaking to them, the interviewer is more inclined to overlook any potential red flags about that candidate that might signal to them that that may not be the best candidate for the position.
What's a red flag?
It could be anything, a gap in a career history. It could be the reason they left the last job. And it can go the other way too. For example, if I have a negative impression of you right off the bat, I'm going to look for information that supports that negative impression, and I may overlook a lot of positive things in order to confirm that initial bias.
Can we play this out here a little bit?
Sure.
Okay, I've never met you before. You're sitting in that chair.
Yeah.
You're nicely dressed. You're nicely groomed. You got a nice watch on.
Yeah.
We're having a very pleasant conversation.
That's right.
Do I need much more to go on than that to know that you seem like a pretty decent fellow and would do a good job for me?
Absolutely. You absolutely do. So I'm an industrial psychologist. I do this for a living. I do research in this area. I can't tell you the number of times where I have interviewed people or assessed people for higher level jobs, and my initial impression has been positive, and then I look at some other objective measures and I'm like, I was wrong.
So you're an expert and you get it wrong.
Absolutely, all the time.
So the objective measures that you think we ought to be looking at, instead of perhaps first impressions that delve into our bias, are what?
You need to look at really things that we know are good predictors of whether someone's going to perform well. So we know that intelligence is a very, very strong predictor of job performance. We know that someone's personality and the degree to which their personality fits with the job at hand is also another very good predictor of whether someone's going to perform well on the job.
So you say intelligence, you mean IQ?
IQ.
So a higher IQ means more likely to be a good employee?
Depending on the job. There are some jobs that definitely do require a high level of intellectual horsepower, and if you don't have that, you're just not going to do well. There are other jobs that may not need as much, but you need to know what level of IQ is appropriate for the job that you're hiring for.
Peter Ungen was in that chair not too long ago, the now departed musical director, maestro of the Toronto Symphony.
Yep.
And I didn't know they did this, but apparently when he hires a new musician for the Toronto Symphony, and I gather lots of symphony orchestras do this, they do it behind a screen.
Yep,
so you can't see the person. Why is that a good idea?
Because what they're trying to do is to remove some of the bias that's inherent in the interview process. So just interacting with someone and knowing that the person in front of me is female or of a certain ethnic group, that is enough to influence my decision making right away. So if I can remove those cues, I can try and remove the bias. And so I can make more objective decisions based on the quality of their performance, particularly in that context.
Couldn't that go the other way as well, though? Meaning that if I have an orchestra, or any company for that matter, that is overwhelmingly male, and I'm trying to right that balance somewhat, I can't favor a potential female candidate if they're behind a screen and I don't know what they look like.
That is definitely true. But what you need to focus on in that situation is, do you have other measures other than the things we know will bias you? So just interacting with the person, doing the standard interview where I ask you, what are your strengths and weaknesses, which is the worst question ever.
Why is that a bad question?
Because everyone knows how to answer it. And so it doesn't differentiate between candidates because everyone's trained on how to answer that question. It's a silly question.
My weakness is I care too much.
Exactly.
I try too hard.
I work too hard,
Yes.
or I am.
Right, pathetic.
Yeah,
It's pathetic. Okay, well, we want to remove bias then from the hiring process. We've given the example of the symphony orchestra, the screen. What are some other ways? Obviously, you're not going to meet somebody for an interview and have a screen between the two of you so you can't see them. So what are some other ways of removing bias from the interview?
Well, one of the things, if you're going to continue to use the interview as a selection procedure, is to ensure that the interview is standardized as possible and based on what the knowledge, the skills, and the abilities are that are required for the job. So you get rid of those silly questions like, what are my strengths and weaknesses? And you base the questions on what people are going to have to do in the job. And you ask them about either their past behavior when they've engaged in those types of activities, or even put them in a situation and ask them to describe what they would do. But always related to the job, have a detailed, standardized process, have more than one interviewer, so you have multiple opinions.
I was just going to ask you about that. I know, I used to work at the CBC a lot of years ago, and whenever you apply for a job at CBC, there'd be 5 people in there.
Yep.
An HR person, an editorial person, a management person, So that's a good idea to have more than one person in the room?
It is a good idea because when you have to make a decision about whether or not you're going to hire a particular candidate, one of the things I always hear is, well, they're not a good fit. Well, good fit, or that idea of fit, is one of the last big smoke screens for our bias. Because it's easy for us to say this person's not a good fit. But when you're in a panel of people, you need to justify, well, why aren't they a good fit? Or why don't you think they have the knowledge and the skills and the abilities to do this job? So it's much more difficult to engage in these biases when you have more than one person making the decision.
But there are workplaces where being a good fit, right? Being able to get along with the team, being able to work well with others, I would suspect is far more important than, whether you groom every day or whether you, you got a high IQ or something like that. I mean, teamwork is important in some places.
Absolutely, and that's why you want to look at not just intelligence. Intelligence is very important, but you also want to look at personality information as well. So if you're using reliable and valid measures of someone's personality, you can assess those personality factors that are related to success in the job. So you can have someone who's really, really smart, but is awful at working with people. They're not going to be successful if that's what the job requires. So you need to have both pieces of evidence to make the right decision.
Gotcha. Okay, get comfortable here. This question is going to require a bit of setup here because in doing research for this discussion, I saw a situation where the Federal Public Service participated in a process whereby they removed identifying information from resumes in order to do what you've just talked about, right? Remove the bias from selection. Maybe, in some workplaces there's a bias against so-called ethnic-sounding names, so they try to take that out of it. They found that after 6 months and a sample size of more than 2,000 applicants, so that's, I assume you would say, a decent size.
Very much.
Okay. The results were visible minority candidates were shortlisted about the same as before. It was 46% versus 47% before the blind process took place. In which case, well, let me just start with a neutral question. What do you infer from that?
What I infer is what most likely occurred there is the fact that the federal government already does a very good job of trying to mitigate bias in their selection process. And so you're already working with an entity that already tries to do the best they can in order to ensure that they have diversity in their selection.
And does pretty well, apparently.
And does pretty well. So as admirable as this effort was to engage in blind hiring, it's not going to have the same impact in an organization that already does things very well as it would in an organization where they don't do anything in order to promote more fair, equitable hiring practices.
I'm going to ask you an outrageous question here, but there's a method to my madness, so hang in there with me. Is it not easier to have more teamwork, better collegiality, everybody getting along better and rowing in the same direction, if, let's say you got a team of 10, if all 10 of those people are white Anglo-Saxon male Protestants who grew up in the north end of Toronto, all went to the same school, all did the same kind of stuff on the weekend, they're all basically the same kind of person, same age, etc.
Yeah.
Is the answer yes to that?
Yes. But the answer is a qualified yes, because what you will have is a lovely, friendly, collegial workplace. What you will not have is any diversity of ideas, a diversity of backgrounds. You're not going to have a lot of dissent, so you're probably going to all think the same, act the same. You're going to have the same solutions to the same problems, and you're not going to innovate or move forward. And that's what diversity brings, a difference of opinions, a different of backgrounds, different educations, and can bring some flavor and dissent to the decision-making processes.
So it may not run more smoothly if you have a more diverse workforce.
Yeah.
But you will get better outcomes at the end of the day.
That is the hope with increased diversity, that you're going to have that better mix of people's backgrounds and skills.
That's clearly the hope, but is that what the empirical evidence tells us?
The empirical evidence is mixed in terms of actual performance of diverse workplaces. We see some benefits absolutely in terms of quality of decision making and diversity of ideas getting recognized. What you do have when you have just a group of homogeneous group of people is that you get the same ideas. You may not have any conflict, and a lack of conflict is sometimes bad for decision making because you get trapped in your same way of seeing the world and thinking, and you just you don't change, you don't innovate, and you don't grow.
You should see our editorial meetings here. Lots of conflict. They're very entertaining.
That's great. And I'm sure the outcomes are good.
I think so. Well, I hope so anyway. Let's talk again about predictors, about whether or not somebody is going to be good. You mentioned the IQ test. Pretty obvious how you do an IQ test. What about a personality test? How are you supposed to figure that out?
Well, here's where the problems are. And the reason that you don't see more personality testing done in organizations is often because the people in charge of recruitment and hiring organizations don't have sufficient knowledge about using the best tools for understanding work-related personality. And so a lot of them don't understand issues of reliability and validity and using tests that are well validated and well studied and demonstrate positive relationships with performance. And you get people who resist that because they don't understand it. And then you see things like really poor personality tests being used in organizations where they shouldn't be, things like Myers-Briggs.
Oh, Myers-Briggs is not good?
No.
Really?
No.
I had to take that before I got hired here. It was a big deal that I apparently passed.
I don't want to get sued, but I will say that in terms of particularly for selection decisions, Myers-Briggs should never be used.
Why not?
Because it is not reliable or valid, and it is not a good indicator of personality and effectiveness in the workplace.
So why do so many people still do it?
Because it's cheap, easy to administer, and easy to interpret.
Oh my God, we're definitely getting sued over this. No, I hope not. This is one of those tests that is sort of the most basic conventional thing that you can do to see whether an employee, a potential employee, will fit in.
That's right.
And you're saying it's not good.
Nope.
Do they know that?
I can't comment on what they know or don't know, but I am telling you as a researcher and as a scientist that Myers-Briggs is not a good tool and should never be used for selection.
What do you prefer?
Anything that is work-related in terms of personality, one that is based on what we've known for decades about personality and the big 5 or even the big 6 factors of personality, and has been validated in different samples of different people across the world and is demonstrated to have relationships with job performance.
IQ more reliable than Myers-Briggs?
Absolutely, without a doubt.
So you go for somebody with a higher IQ than somebody who scored well on Myers-Briggs?
I wouldn't even look at the Myers-Briggs data. I would just throw that out.
Yikes. All right, well, all right. Can I throw a little high fastball at your chin right now?
Sure.
Okay, you work at the University of Toronto.
Absolutely, yep.
The University of Toronto has thousands upon thousands of very well-paid professors working there.
That's right.
Do they use these techniques that you're advancing here?
The University of Toronto is definitely committed to excellence in hiring and selection. What I see is that they don't always rely on the expertise that they have in their faculty. And so, the desire is there to do things well and do things right. We don't always see it being played out the way it should.
Why not?
I think it goes back to a lack of education and awareness by people who are making these decisions in human resources, and that they approach using well-validated objective measures with a little bit of suspicion because they don't understand the science behind it, and so they resist it.
This may be too late given that you're on the air right now, but did you tell your HR department at U of T to watch this interview tonight?
I'm sure they'll see it.
I hope so. Well, I mean, it is kind of funny that the place that is sort of propagating this kind of expertise to generations upon generations of students doesn't follow its own advice.
Well, I teach my students the right way to do things.
You do?
I do.
Okay.
Absolutely. And so do a number of my colleagues who are in this field.
Is it that I'm trying to figure out why it would be this way. Are human resources personnel so wedded to the way that they do things because if they didn't do things that way, we might not need them as much? I mean, is this about self-preservation for HR people?
I don't know if it's about self-preservation as much as just not being as aware as they could be about the proper ways of engaging in selection and using the right tools and understanding the fundamental science beneath them so that they're making good choices about the tools that they're using. I think that's what needs to happen with the HR profession more generally, a greater understanding of these key issues that should drive better decisions.
You should have a chat with them.
I've tried.
And? Not yet, eh?
They know my views. Let's put it that way.
That's great. Okay. David Zweig is the chair of the Department of Management, UT Scarborough, and it's been great having you here at TVO tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.